The day-to-day fighting of the war in Ukraine often seems like a clash of contradictions. On one hand, pictures of muddy trenches, barbed wire, and mangled trees look straight out of World War I, but in the meantime we see both sides moving forward in drone warfare technology that is completely changing the way we understand war to be fought. If you've been following Russia's war over the last year or so, you've probably heard that the lack of manpower, especially infantry, is now the biggest challenge for Ukraine, not the lack of shells or tanks. You've probably also heard about how the use of drones, especially cheap first-person view or FPV drones, have been employed by both sides in a way that is completely changing the tactical picture on the ground. More than anything else, it is these two factors, the infantry war and the drone war, that are defining how Ukraine is waging its defensive fight on the tactical level. Now, in the fourth year of Russia's full-scale war, it is the interplay between them that could define which side gets the upper hand on the battlefield going forward. And while the front line hasn't been moving quite as much lately, here in Ukraine, things are changing, and they're changing fast. So fast that soon the very philosophy of how a positional war is fought might be turned on its end. So what does this really look like on the ground, and what does it tell us about how the war will continue to develop over the rest of the year? My name is Farrell, a reporter here at the Kyiv Independent. Every day we try our best to bring you, the viewer, as close as possible to the battlefields of Ukraine. And today we're going to try and do that with a bit of a new format of video. We can't do this without your help. To make sure we can continue our work in what is looking to be an absolute roller coaster of a year, consider joining our community of members by clicking the link below. Now, to help tell this story, we are going to take you to two dugouts from one brigade, the 14th National Guard, better known as Chervona Kalyna after the famous Ukrainian folk song. For about half a year, this brigade has been holding the line with distinction in one of the toughest parts of the front line, near Pokrovsk in Donetsk Oblast. The first dugout we'll visit belongs to Ukrainian FPV or first-person drone team. In a well-built shelter a few kilometers from the zero line, this drone team prepares for the morning's work. Instead of enduring endless bombardment in the trenches or firing decades-old artillery guns, their work happens through the tight bond between the eyes of the pilot in his goggles and the camera on the drone.
Скажи, що дуже сильний туман, що ми тепер ще поки що працювати не можемо.
На підльотах до Клєвера дуже сильний туман, не бачимо навіть дороги.
Є. Картинка в мене, да.
Черговий, готові до роботи, дрон на взльоті. Яка точка? Повторіть для нас, будь ласка. Завдяки успішній роботі всіх наших суміжних підрозділів, і нас в тому числі, ворог дуже рідко зараз використовує техніку. Максимум, що він може дозволити собі, це піхота і мотоцикли. І то дуже рідко мотоцикли. За останніх кілька тижнів був тільки одна спроба, була механізованого штурму, і вона у ворога не увінчалася успіхом. Вони навіть не доїхали нормально до точки десантування, і ворог був успішно знищений.
Оце, так? Да?
Оце лівіше під тобою.
Оце прямо тут.
Ага. Керуєш?
Так, я не знаю. Відпало управління.
These drone operators are part of Chervona Kalyna's strike drone company. Specialized drone units are now standard across the Ukrainian military, and they are constantly expanding from company level to battalion, battalion to regiment, and even regiment to a whole brigade of drones.
Перебувають, добре. Летим на цілю.
Диви, як вони собі там спокійно гуляють, ти навіс, чуєш?
Ребята, я надію, що вони перед тим, як тебе почути, що вони не встигнуть забігти. Пробуєш зі сторони дороги залетіти. Плюс.
Ну, я думаю, що зараз в подвір'я залетить.
Є вікно, робимо контакт. Плюс.
Бувають дні, коли менше руху піхоти, і тоді ми більше відпочиваємо, менше працюємо. А бувають дні, коли в нас просто вильот за вильотом. Власне кажучи, ворог дуже адаптувався до війни дронів, до того, що їх знищують якраз FPV-дронами, скидами і різними бомберами. Вони змінили свою тактику, вплоть до того, Не тільки протидія дронова, тобто вони зараз встановлюють і багато ребів, ведуть реп-боротьбу, реп-розвідку, вишукують так само наші екіпажі, щоб їм було зручніше проходити, стараються максимально блокувати нашу роботу, стараються переміщуватись, так як сьогодні, в туманну погоду, щоб в нас була гірша видимість. Якщо йде дощ, сніг і в нас просто неможливі умови роботи, вони також використовують це для своїх переміщень. А коли погода ясна і ясна видимість, вони обмежують свої переміщення. Також рухаються невеликими групами по 2-3 людини, щоб вони були менш палівні, можна так сказати. Використовують для своїх переміщень густі посадки, щоб їх було менше видно. І відкриті ділянки стараються проходити максимально швидко.
Meanwhile, in the rear, Ukraine's domestic drone industry has ramped up production over 2024, pumping out thousands of FPV drones per day, each at less than 1/10 the price of the average NATO standard artillery shell. In a far cry from the times when FPV drones first started to arrive on the battlefield, aiming at mostly tanks and other armored vehicles, their main target now is Russian infantry. Sometimes on vehicles, but more often on foot, they move forward in small, expendable groups of 3 to 6 with one job: get up the field and dig in. What all this means is that anything that is spotted moving out in the open less than 5 kilometers from the front line, whether man or vehicle, can now be targeted by multiple, cheap, high-precision strikes from a distance within the space of a few minutes. With improvements to drone technology and the use of signal boosters, that zone is getting widened constantly, with targets at 10 or even 20 kilometers back also hit more and more often. Even when the enemy soldiers are taking cover, drones can also be used to fly straight into trenches and dugouts, taking them apart bit by bit. In the year since US military aid was held up in Congress, Ukraine's drone revolution has not only made up for the shell shortage, but has since become the main fire asset responsible for stopping Russian attacks in their tracks. As a bonus, the shift to domestically made drones means that Ukraine's frontline defense is less dependent on foreign deliveries of artillery shells, giving Kyiv plenty of solid baseline firepower that can be deployed quickly anywhere. Going forward, the increasing expansion and effectiveness of drone units across the front line will be crucial to thwarting Russia's offensive plans for spring and summer. But there is a catch. As we have seen for years now, Russia is also doing the same thing, more or less keeping up parity with Ukraine when it comes to the drone game. Often, even when Ukraine makes a technological breakthrough, Russia copies it and quickly scales up production of its own. One of the most important recent innovations, the use of drones with long spools of fiber optic that make them undetectable and unjammable, was actually brought to the battlefield by the Russians first, and it is now Ukraine who is playing catch-up. All this means that the Ukrainian side of the front line is often no less deadly than the Russian side for any soldiers or vehicles moving around. Arriving on an armored vehicle, we also visited an infantry company command post of the Chervona Kalyna Brigade. This dugout is the eyes, ears, and brains of frontline infantry tactics. Despite the intensity of the fighting here, Chervona Kalyna's defense of its sector is holding strong, thanks to good organization aided by favorable terrain and the fact that they still have a decent number of infantrymen.
В нашому підрозділі відсотків 80, напевно, людей, які готові працювати, які розуміють, що це за робота, що потрібно зробити і які можуть бути результати. Всі пілоти у нас, до речі, також бойові. Вони всі були на позиціях як піхота, тому вони чудово розуміють, якщо якась проблема з підвозом провізії, ми можемо до них звернутися. Вони скидуються з дронів, ще щось. Тобто водичку чи там з вампірами можемо кидати якісь більше провізії. Там і їжу можемо кинути, водичку, і, можливо, якісь інші їм потребності.
Вілі, я малюк. Бачиш мене, бачиш?
Вілі, малюк, бачу тебе, ховайся.
Плюс прийняв.
Малюк, я Вілі, можете забирати.
Плюс, Вілі, дякую велике.
Смачного, ростіть широкі. Це вампір, це великий дрон, який має вантажопідйомність до 15 кг, і на дальній позиції він завозить провізію, воду і при потребі боєприпаси. Це якраз був скид провізії, щоб люди не ходили, не ризикували з собою. Вилітає дрон, якраз зараз така година сіряк, і скидає провізію для людей.
Each Ukrainian position in this company has at least 3 foot soldiers manning it, and communications and logistics are all under control. While Moscow still has a plentiful supply of single-use foot soldiers, Kyiv is fighting for its people, not only its territory, and must protect each infantryman as much as possible. But 3 years of full-scale war are taking their toll. Ukraine is struggling with a severe manpower crisis, provoked by shortcomings in mobilization, training, and excess losses taken because of poor command decisions. The situation is by far the worst in the infantry itself. Because of the saturation of the sky with enemy drones at work night and day, the deadliest part of the job becomes the trip to positions and back. The best countermeasure to this often ends up being simply not making that trip as often. As a result, when a normal shift on positions used to be a few days, now spending a few weeks with supplies flown in by drone has become the new normal. Things get really dire if a soldier is wounded. Evacuation vehicles can no longer drive up close to the front line to pick up casualties due to the drone threat, and soldiers often have to wait for days in unsanitary conditions before a window of opportunity to escape arrives. As the sun rises outside the dugout, Russian forces attack the brigade's positions on motorcycles. What happens next is a clear example of how quickly any enemy movement out in the open can be targeted and destroyed.
Ще один видих. Сховався.
Я підлітаю,
Біжить.
плюс, підлітаєш, работай.
Плюс, уважно слухай та спостерігай.
Вони по мотоциклу відпрацювали. Пряме влучання по мозку є.
Це емоції. Це вони пробують, вони шукають слабку точку, де їм вдасться найдовше протягнутися, затягнутися, і далі вони пробують це місце пробивати вже і на техніці заїжджати, на квадроциклах, на машинах, на мотокросах. Ось бачите, техніка знищена, провізія скинута, знищена, і зараз буде знищено ще ворога.
So where does that leave us, and what does it mean for the future of the tactical picture as the war goes on? In something we haven't really done before, I want to show you here on this tablet by looking at a map of what the fight for an average village could look like in Ukraine. This one, Ivanivka in Donetsk Oblast, was occupied back in autumn last year, so this is all illustrative and there will be nothing sensitive shown here. Back in 2023, what the battles looked like is still a version of that typical World War I style tactical picture. So you had more or less the idea of Ukrainian lines somewhere along here and Russian lines maybe there, with what we understood as a gray zone in between. So you could imagine here, for example, you had a Ukrainian positions in these houses, in these tree lines, basically all ready to lay down fire on advancing Russian infantry, which would come up through these tree lines, along these roads. There was this understanding that you reach the Ukrainian positions, you take them, and then the front line moves, and the gray zone moves with it. Further back, you would have Ukrainian mortar teams, maybe here, maybe drone teams further back, artillery, and so on, and they would all be working in these areas. And the same would go on the Russian side. Their own mortars, drone teams, all working on that gray zone. In a positional war like this one, the foot soldiers, the infantrymen, are still key to both sides' fight. Control of territory still requires humans to be dug in on the ground. Now this area here, maybe the front line itself, the so-called zero line, and a kilometer further back was, of course, incredibly deadly for infantrymen. But further back, with more distance, it gets safer. Everyone working further back, these medical evacuations, logistics, infantry rotating in and out, mortar and drone teams, that's, from 2 kilometers further back, they could work in more or less relative safety, with the understanding that here in front of them, the infantry is holding the line. Over 2024, this started to change, and change quickly. Ukraine's infantry situation got progressively worse, which means that we have now far fewer infantrymen on these positions and far more space in between them, which means a hole in the front line. Meanwhile, the drone-infested sky makes moving and fighting on the very zero line, but also in the zone behind it, much more difficult. This whole area between here and maybe even further back, all these logistics routes that the Ukrainian military relies on to get close to the front line are now under control of drones. But still, for a long time, the prevailing philosophy held firm. You can't control a field or a village like Ivanivka without your infantrymen holding it. But now, in 2025, we are beginning to see the end result of this change, and it's not pretty. At this point, the Ukrainian infantry is even more spread out, leaving even bigger gaps in the front line in many areas. But more importantly, because the sky is so saturated with drones, they're not actually really able to do this fighting. This firing out and controlling fields and defending actually physically against the Russian attacking forces is actually now almost impossible because you can't get your head out and you need to stay inside your dugout or your basement the whole time. Meanwhile, on the Russian side, because of Ukrainian drones, the battlefield is just as deadly, but what they do have is these expendable infantrymen which they just keep sending up in human waves. And as the picture for the Ukrainian infantrymen on the front line gets deadlier, the same also goes for all the logistics in the zone behind. So where previously an area of maybe 3 kilometers was already very deadly for anything moving around, now the saturation of drones and the improvement of the range of these drones on both sides means that now 10 kilometers back, all of these logistics routes, whether that's infantry rotating, medical evacuation, supplies, or also now these Ukrainian mortar and drone teams who also work at that distance, now their work is increasingly dangerous. On the Russian side, it's not that easy either. Their logistics are also hunted by Ukrainian drones, and often their small infantry assault groups, which is the main way they attack now, along tree lines, along roads like this, or in many cases, such as in this village, just going from house to house, slowly taking a bit more territory. It's actually very difficult for them to even reach the Ukrainian infantry positions in the first place, because every time you get out on the surface and you move, each single infantryman is being hunted. But if they do reach those infantry positions, that's where the real problems start to begin for the Ukrainian defense. Because Ukrainian infantry positions are now so spread out, often leaving maybe hundreds of meters in between them, and because the infantrymen are forced to keep their heads down the whole time, now often the Russians will just bypass these infantry positions and dig in deeper behind Ukrainian lines, although they're difficult to call lines anymore. And that's what we see now. Sometimes they even go further, and we've also heard reports of, if they make it far enough, Russian troops starting to even assault Ukrainian mortar and drone teams that are further back behind infantry lines. That doesn't mean the infantry isn't there anymore, but it just means that they haven't been able to form a complete solid line to stop the Russians. And what this means in general is that we start to see kind of degrading of the idea of a front line in general. Not this blue line, not this red line. Instead, what we see is basically a question of which side has troops in which holes. Ukrainian infantry might have people in this basement, maybe 2 people in this basement, over here, maybe people in a dugout here, but meanwhile the attacking Russian forces will have bypassed them, and they've got a few people sitting in a dugout there, in a basement here, and maybe some are already gathering for the next attack going even deeper. Meanwhile, because both sides are hunting enemy logistics in such an intense way, the gray zone, which used to be this little area between the front line, has now become much wider. You can see here, this whole village, the fields around it, the roads, everything starts to blend into one gray zone. And the question for Ukraine is that a way they can fight sustainably in the future? When we talk about drone warfare, Often you hear the slogan that robots and drones should be fighting instead of humans. Now the combination of the dire manpower crisis and the increasing saturation of the sky with drones is meaning that that philosophy of infantry being key is starting to be questioned itself. We haven't reached that point quite yet. In brigades where the defense is truly under control, like that of Chervona Kalyna, you can see the fighting is still done in the old way because the logistics are under control, there are enough infantrymen to man the positions, and the commanders know where the Ukrainian infantrymen are and where the Russians are. But in other parts of the front line, especially in other brigades where the infantry situation is even more dire, commanders are starting to ask the question of, well, what is the point of these infantrymen in these holes if they're not able to fight, if getting them in and out is so difficult and so deadly? What some of them are saying, including to me personally in some of my frontline visits, is that instead of having those infantry, what they should focus more on is just getting better and better at having more fire assets, especially drones, to turn this whole gray zone into an incredibly deadly kill zone for any Russians coming in. And that means using distance mining, using FPV drones, using other kinds of bomber drones, coordinating them with the work of artillery to make sure that any Russians who come through this area will be eliminated on the spot. Because if the Russians still get through, then they will be assaulting drone teams, mortar teams directly. Now this is of course completely transforming the idea that we have of how war is being fought, and we don't know if this is going to be feasible going forward. But having seen the trajectory of the war over 2023, 2024, and now going into a very scary phase globally in 2025, this is the challenge that Ukraine will have to find a solution to be able to keep fighting. While the world watches every new development of the merry-go-round that is US President Donald Trump's efforts to negotiate a peace, what we see here is a reminder of how important it is not to forget the battlefield. Because what is going on here, this delicate dance between infantry and drones, can and will change the face of warfare forever.
Thank you for watching this video. Independent journalism needs a community, not a paywall. Help us reach 20,000 members and keep our work open to everyone.